Welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. Today we have Associate Professor Mele Taumoepeau with us and talking about language. And this works really well because our last recording was on creativity and we touched upon language a little bit there. So getting someone who is a trained and practiced speech and language therapist before doing their PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Otago. Associate Professor Mele then joined Victoria University of Wellington earlier this year and has done many things with her research focusing on developmental psychology and aging, language, communication and culture, and Pacific people's health. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Would you like to give us a brief overview of speech and language therapy? Because that's something I really don't know much about.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. So speech and language therapy, it's a really, really broad area. It's a really, really broad profession. I think that's why I loved it so much. So it's basically you are trained to help children or adults who, for some reason, are not able to use language effectively or speech. So it's called a speech and language therapist because people often think about speech and language therapists or SLTs as perhaps more about elocution and about pronunciation and sounds, and that it can be part of that. Like if a child is not developing their sound system, they can't go on to then use language and communicate. So we definitely do work with children and helping them with their sound systems. But also we do work with perhaps children who are not using language, so they might not be developing their vocabulary, or they're finding it difficult to put words together into little sentences. So what we think about is grammar or syntax. And so that's more the language side of things rather than just a sort of speech and articulation. And then it's so wide ranging. So you could be working with a child who might have been born with a cleft palate. So there's like a little, fissure at the top of their in their hard palate. And so you can imagine that that's going to affect their ability to use speech. So you would get a speech and language therapist, working with them. Right to the other end of the spectrum where someone might have had a stroke. And so, that's, having a stroke, you have aphasia, which is your it affects your ability to communicate and use language. And so, you might be actually helping them develop that ability, or you might be giving them aids, communication aids, so that they are functionally able to communicate, even if they may not be able to actually articulate or use language itself. So it's really wide ranging. So it's a 3 or 4 year degree. I was actually trained at Queen Margaret College in Edinburgh. So I went over there to do that, and I worked in the UK for a couple of years. But it's a really wonderful job. Loved it so much. And I worked mainly with children. So I went in thinking I was going to work with, I was really interested in stroke and aphasia and working with older people, but I ended up working with kids and really loved it. And then came to New Zealand and worked here as well as a speech and language therapist. And there's a slightly different system here. So I did a lot more work in schools. It's more of an integrated system. So children with speech and language difficulties participate in the education, the mainstream education. So I worked with schools and with families. And then I decided I wanted to actually go and understand a little bit more about the theory behind this. And that's when I did my PhD. Yeah.
Amazing. So that was in developmental psychology?
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. And what was your PhD on?
So my PhD was on looking at how parents talk to their children about the minds of other people. So, when you go about your daily life, you're basically mind reading. When you see someone walk through the door or you see someone walk into a shop, you don't just see a person physically walking through a door or through, or into a shop. You're actually thinking about what they might be feeling or wanting or doing, So you can explain behavior by thinking about what's going on in other people's minds. And I was really interested in how children develop this or can do this. And I'm very interested in the environment. So I wanted to understand how is it that the ways that parents talk to their children might help them learn about the minds of other people. And so it turned out that parents modify their language when they're talking to very young children. So they might start out talking a lot about what a child wants. So if you want something that's an internal state, you can't see it, but you get some clues in the environment as to what someone might be wanting. And so parents latch onto that, and they might talk a lot about what their kids want. So this is around sort of 15 months. And then as they get a little bit older, parents shift their talk to things that are a little bit more unobservable, like what they might think or what they might know. And so what I sort of discovered or learnt about was the fact that parents scaffold their language. You know, kids don't just come out of the womb and into the home and parents talk at a certain level. They adapt to where the child's at. And it turns out that sort of scaffolded talking about the mind helps children arrive at an understanding a little bit earlier. So talking about the mental states of other people is really useful for kids when they're learning about the mental states of others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're saying that by scaffolding, it actually makes it easier for the child to develop, as opposed to if you started at like a higher level.
That's right, yeah. And it's linked into a lot of psychological theory about, you might have heard about the zone of proximal development, one of Vygotsky's theories, where parents who push their children just a little bit above their capabilities, children are then able to sort of learn a bit quicker. All right, so you pitch your intervention, or you pitch how you might be talking to a child just a little bit above what they can do on their own, right? And so I sort of applied a similar idea that, you know, parents will talk about desires at a time when children are sort of just on the cusp of learning about their own and others' desires. So this is when, you know, around 15, 18 months, children are beginning to learn about themselves, you know. So if they look in the mirror, they're beginning to learn that actually that person there is me, and that I'm an entity, you know, I am a physical being. Prior to that, children will look in the mirror and just sort of go, oh, that's an interesting little, you know, there's lots of funny little clips on the internet about this. So once you learn that you're an actual person, then you're in a position to begin to understand that other people might have their own thoughts and feelings and desires, you know. So there's sort of an interesting timing at this. So it sort of goes hand in hand with all the other things that children are learning when they're developing. Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I would have thought that you always had an understanding that you were a person, and you know, maybe even if you're young, like this is me and that's the world. So how do they operate before that kind of understanding?
Yeah, well, they don't realise that. You know, they literally, I mean, there's lots of tests that you can do. You know, they literally will, I mean, you know, I think obviously you're aware of your body, but you're not aware of yourself as a separate entity from someone else. And that, meaning that you are a person with a mind, you know, and I mean, very young children won't be thinking explicitly like that, but knowing that you are different from someone else. You know, you might like salted caramel ice cream. Someone else might like, you know, straight vanilla. You know, and so, you know, when you're moving out of those terrible twos where you know, kids just think everyone likes the same thing as you. You know, it's a very me-centered time, and it takes a wee while for them to understand. Well, oh, that person actually has different, you know, desires and preferences than me. You know? So there's very much a whole developmental timetable to all of this, and parents can make contributions to that development.
Yeah, would you say it's quite natural for parents to use like just the right kind of language at the right time? Does that come quite naturally?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the really interesting thing, is that there's a lot of variation, and that's what I'm really interested in, is all the individual variation. So some parents are particularly sensitive to, you know, their child's level of development. Other parents aren't, you know, and you know, my feeling is that it all evens out in the end, you know. But from a theoretical perspective, it's very interesting to understand, well, if parents do more of this, do children arrive at these milestones a little bit earlier? Because it helps you understand the mechanisms of change, you know, what's really going on, and what's affecting change in children's development. And so it turns out in a Western context that, yes, parents who do use a lot more of this language that refers to the minds of the child or the minds of other people, that they do pass these tests. There's lots of tests that we have in psychology that test children's actual understanding of the mind. So they just pass those tests a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. It means that the environment does actually have an effect on children's development. You know, it's not just that. Yeah.
Ooh, on that, can we look at it from the child side now? How easy is it to actually pick up a language? How does a child go about actually doing that?
Yeah. So that it's wonderful to think about that, because, you know, children are just predisposed to pick up language. And so when I'm teaching this, I remind students that, you know, when a baby is born, that's all they're doing. You know, all they're doing is basically learning language. You know, there's nothing else really that they're doing in life. They're interacting with people around them, and they're absorbing this code, you know, this communication code. And so children are really, really well disposed to learn language. So it's not hard work for them, you know. So for most children, they will acquire language effortlessly. And so that's what's really interesting as an SLT or speech and language therapist. It's like, why is this child not acquiring language? You know, and because it's something that you don't actually have to teach children. You know, they will just pick it up, no matter what, and they'll pick up multiple languages no matter what.
Yeah. Can you go through any reasons for that? Why is it so much harder for adults to pick up languages versus children?
Right. Yeah. There's lots of reasons. I mean, there are some theories around, puberty, that after a certain period, our ability to acquire language becomes a bit more sort of fixed, a bit harder, because of those developmental changes. And children are particularly well designed actually to pick up on patterns in the environment. And it's not just language patterns, actually. They're very good at picking up visual patterns, and they're very good at making sense of these patterns. So what might seem just like sort of a random collection of sounds or a random collection of pictures or sort of visual patterns, babies are able to pick up on the actual recurring patterns that might be occurring, and they can do this at a rate that adults, it just doesn't even compare to adults. And so this ability to pick up patterns then, allows them to acquire the language very, very quickly. Adults get to a point where they don't quite have that implicit ability because they've already sort of learnt the language, so they spend more time actually reflecting on it, and that's sort of quite hard work, So I don't know if I've quite answered your question. There's many reasons, but those are some of them.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that they would have that like implicit ability because they kind of need to.
Yes, that's
vulnerable
right.
And
that's right. And there's nothing really else going on. That's why I talk about the idea that they're spending their time just doing this. They're basically being bombarded with all this information, and they're having to make sense of all that.
Yeah, and I think I remember hearing that even, babies in the womb, they have a preference for a certain language, even, almost like they're still tuned in when they're... Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, they really are. And what that type of work speaks to is some of the early skills that infants bring. So infants can detect the difference between languages that have quite different rhythms. And so the infants are not really picking up on what we call the actual segments of language. What they're picking up is more sort of a global sense of the language. And that global sense is really about the rhythm. So languages differ in their rhythms. Some have put emphasis on the first syllable, the first parts of the words. Others put more emphasis on the end. Others have a more even pattern, or in an even rhythm. And babies are able to pick up on that. So if you play, the child's heritage language, or what we call their ambient language, the language that they're hearing around them, and then you play a language that is quite different in terms of its rhythm, they're able to, hear those differences. Yeah, and that's happening in the womb. Yeah.
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 Yeah, it sounds like babies can do a lot more than we give them credit for. They're not just kind of these little...
Absolutely, yeah. But babies are super smart, and they're extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, is there anything else that comes to mind with their kind of abilities or...
I mean, not really. I mean, I could probably go on forever about it. But
yeah. And I was wondering if you could speak to development and culture, because I know that's something that you work a lot on.
Yeah, and I'm been increasingly more interested in this, because if we go back to some of the work that I did in my PhD, which was looking at the language that parents use with their children and how that influences their development, I was really aware that growing up in Tonga, that's where I grew up, that actually some of the interactions that I was describing as being really important for children just didn't take place in Tonga. And so I was really fascinated by this because, children the world over grow into these, healthy, functioning adults. But so what it really brought home to me was the fact that in psychology, we need to examine development across a broad range of cultural contexts. So for instance, in Tonga, we don't, the types of interactions that you see with children are really quite different. So we don't tend to talk about our internal states, and parents don't tend to talk to their children about their internal states. Yet Tongan children will grow up to be completely competent in terms of what we describe as social understanding or the understanding of other people's minds. Mm-hmm. And so what is really apparent is that children and adults and their parents or caregivers adapt to the cultural context that they're in. So our cultures drive what is important, and parents continue to foster the things that cultures consider to be important, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a way in which we perpetuate culture. And so I'm very interested in the social goals that parents have for children. Mm-hmm. And this sort of brings us into, you'll be familiar with these notions of individualism and collectivism. So certain cultures foster very strong cultural individual mandates. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in those kinds of cultures, it makes a lot of sense to talk about the child as an individual. Mm. And what is more individual than talking about what you personally feel or think, right? So what you're highlighting to the child is that in your environment, the individual is very important. Mm-hmm. And I can demonstrate that by talking about your internal states. Whereas in a Tongan context, the collective is much more important than the individual. And so your sense of self is bound up entirely with other people. And so it doesn't make sense to talk about you as individual by referring a lot to other people's mental states. Mm-hmm. What becomes much more important for children in those contexts is understanding how to behave in different environments. Mm-hmm. So you have to learn how to observe. You have to learn how to adapt. You have to understand what is required of you in this situation as opposed to this situation. Mm-hmm. And so that is really appropriate for that context. Mm-hmm. So if you bring a child and stick them in that context and they're used to talking about themselves and their own internal states, then they will stick out. It's jarring. Mm-hmm. And then vice versa. If you're used to sitting back in the classroom and not saying anything, which was my experience coming here, it's just it's so alien, it's so bizarre. And so I think that's a really important thing. We have to understand that the context determines how parents will behave with children, and they are operating under this cultural mandate. I'm perpetuating the things that are really important for you to grow up to be successful in the culture that you're in at the moment. Mm-hmm. So those are sort of ideas that I'm exploring.
I hope you can speak a bit to this, both through your research and through your own personal experience. Yeah. Because in your bio, it says that you've come from a bicultural background. So how does that come into play, especially if one culture is more individualistic and the other is more, more collectivist? Yeah, absolutely. So I've never really belonged anywhere. So that's a summary of that. It's a really interesting... It's really interesting growing up in that way. So I was brought up in Tonga, and I came here when I was 12. And I was brought up, my mother is Scottish and my father is Tongan, and I was brought up in a
in a Tongan sort of, bicultural setting, largely brought up by my grandmother and my 4 cousins. So we all lived together. But it's really... It's really interesting. I mean, the positive side of it is that you become very flexible. You learn how to adapt. And, it's a bit like, I think of it as a superpower, So I think if you can master these 2 ways of being, then, it's a really awesome thing to have. And so this is, something that, I think is so amazing about Aotearoa is that, everyone actually has the potential to have this superpower. Mm-hmm. On the downside, it is very difficult fitting in, because you actually have to think about who you are and where you belong. And often you don't really belong anywhere, you've got a foot in either camp. So these are the kinds of things that I used to think about when I was a lot younger. And it's interesting when you travel, you are forced to confront these things about your identity, who are you? And so I spent a lot of time traveling overseas. I went to the UK to sort of discover my Scottish side. And that was really interesting. But then I was very happy to come back to New Zealand because I really felt that I, belonged in this part of the world. Yeah. So those are my initial impressions of that. I mean, I could talk a lot about this. I'm very, very interested in identity, per se, and that's actually led me to do some work particularly with Pacific young people, and well-being and the role that identity plays. You really have to, and this is all tied up with a lot of social psychology in terms of belonging. You really have to feel that you belong somewhere in order to feel happy in yourself. So how do we structure our environments so people feel that they belong? And this is one of the reasons why I came back here, is that it was wonderful to come back and say my name on the phone when I'm ringing up, I don't know, Telecom or whatever, and someone on the other phone either saying it back to me perfectly or not asking me how to spell it, And it's little things like that they may seem so trivial, but it's amazing how powerful it is for helping you feel that you belong in the context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you feel like a lot of the social or psychological research can be quite validating for a lot of people? Like if they feel they don't belong somewhere, maybe here are the differences here, or here's maybe what you've been experiencing? Or...
Yeah, and I think so. If that kind of work gets done. Yeah, and I think we have a bit of a problem in psychology where there's very little culture and psychology work done. So we have wide-ranging theories, particularly in child development, that have been developed really just through a particular focus on, Western groups. And so I think it's very validating for groups that they're described by Heinrich as, weird or non-weird, so Western, industrial, rich, democratic contexts. It is really validating to see yourself represented in that work. Yeah, I think that's very important. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think there should be a greater cultural or cross-cultural perspective in the mainstream psychology that's taught?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's from a scholarly perspective, it's very exciting because it really broadens your understanding of the human experience, which is what psychology is about. And so, thinking about, well, if in my work it's important to talk about mental states for children's development of an understanding of mind, yet you have cultural contexts where that doesn't happen very much, what then is helping children in that context develop an understanding of the minds of others? So it forces you to really challenge and understand in a very deep way, how children develop the way they do. Mm-hmm. So my perspective is that it's very liberating. And that's why I'm interested in doing that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to any research examples as well? Of like you said, how probably cultural contexts are different, but children still grow up to develop to have certain abilities.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, I can talk a little bit about some of the work I've done in Tonga. So in my area of research, which is called theory of mind, and I was saying this is about mind understanding, there seems to be a hierarchy in terms of children's development of an understanding of mind. So they tend to learn that we have different desires, for instance. So that's sort of relatively easy. So around 2 to 3, children know that you're going to pick that kind of ice cream because you like it, whereas I'm going to pick this because I like it. And then children begin to learn that they learn a little bit about the source of knowledge. So you will know something because maybe someone told it to you, or maybe you saw it happen. All right, and so you're going to look for something because you know it's there. And then they also begin to learn about belief. You might walk into the shop because you believe that the ice cream is actually there. And so if, Mele walks into the shop because she believes that I can buy salted caramel, but in fact that shop is not selling salted caramel, she might still go there because she believes it's there. But she's going there because she actually has a false belief. Right? And this is quite a high level of understanding of the minds of other people. And this has been sort of described as a litmus test of children's understanding of mind, that you know that people can be motivated by a false belief. All right. So she'll go into the shop because she believes that there's salted caramel ice cream, even though it's not there. Right. And it may be that they've just changed their menu. All right. You've done it many times, oh, why are they going there? Oh, because, she thinks or she believes that it's there, but in fact it's not. Now, there are other things that children are able to do as well, and that's they can understand that you might want to hide your emotion. All right. So depending on the context, you might feel really awful, but you put on a brave face. Okay. Or you might believe that someone's motivated to do something because they have this strong emotional response. And so what researchers have done up until sort of recently, they've shown that there's this developmental pattern. So false belief is really hard, and children at around age 5 seem to do quite well on it. Hidden emotion, understanding that you can hide your emotion, is even harder. And so, sort of age 6, children begin to pass that task. But what is really interesting is that in a lot of Pacific contexts, so there's some work in Vanuatu that in fact Jason Lowe did, who's in our department, and I was doing some work in Tonga, and across actually other cultural groups. What they've shown is that children actually find it really hard to pass these false belief tasks. All right, so even beyond age 5, children, from some Pacific contexts, find that really quite difficult. And so this is where we have to be really careful in psychology that there's not a value associated with these developmental milestones. It doesn't mean that child is any better or worse, or that a child in a Western context is better or worse. What we have to do is understand, why is that the case? And so you have to do research in those areas. And as it turns out, children in these cultural contexts, so from the Pacific, are actually very good at the hidden emotion tasks. So they pass these a lot earlier. Similarly, they will pass tasks around knowledge earlier than tasks around belief. And this is the same in children in Iranian contexts and Chinese contexts. Understanding knowledge and how you know things, and knowing that knowing things is important, seems to be something that's fostered in these particular cultures. Whereas having an opposing belief to someone, and knowing that you might believe that, but she believes something different, is something that is not likely to be fostered, all right, particularly in collectivistic cultures. So again, I come back to this idea that, what is important in the culture drives children's cognitive development. Whereas in a Western context, understanding that you might have different beliefs comes before understanding that the source of knowledge. So what you find is these different developmental patterns. And so that's a really intriguing finding. If I just go back to the one in the Pacific with Vanuatu and Tonga, that hidden emotion is something that children learn earlier. And in fact, children in these contexts seem to be very attuned to other people's emotions. And so we need to do more research to understand why. But if you come back to the idea that children in Pacific contexts need to be very adaptive to the different situations, they need to be able to read how someone is behaving quite well, and And in order to do that, you often have to be attuned to a person's emotional state. So you're less likely to talk about it. But what children are able to do in perceptive context is that they're able to pick up on these non-verbal cues. All right. So, that's a really important reminder as a researcher that we might focus a lot on the verbal code and we ignore the non-verbal code. And the non-verbal code is often, as important when children are growing up and learning language, and particularly important in cultures that are more collectivistic, and you have to sort of pay attention to behaviour. Yeah. I feel like I'm talking an awful lot here.
No, it's ideal. It's ideal. So they would easily be able to pick up if someone else, they seemed like they were upset, but they were trying to hide that.
That's right. Yeah. So you have little stories where, someone has been, teased, but they have to pretend that they don't experience that. And so you ask little questions about, how was she really feeling and how does she pretend to feel, so you try and get to it that way. And my Tongan children were very good at this. They knew exactly what the person was doing. Because their experience probably in having to attend to those nonverbal cues. Yeah. That's great. It sounds like it would add to a lot of, like you say, social cohesion and... Yes. Yeah, that's right.
I had a question. I was wondering if that kind of cultural understanding, did that flow into your speech and language therapy things? Like, is that something that you would have to consider sometimes?
Yeah, that is a great question.
Yeah.
It didn't... Yeah, okay, how do I describe this? Yeah. I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I think there's been some great progress in understanding the role of culture when children are learning language. And so at the time, it didn't play as much of a role. And it's since I've been doing the research and become more interested in it that I've been paying a lot more attention to it. Yeah. But I think we have moved much more as a society and understanding that the different contexts that children grow up in, we really need to attend to them in a very explicit way and think about how we intervene and how we help children depending on their context. So this idea of one size fits all is just not going to work, so you have to be really sensitive to children's different contexts. So it means that in your training, you have to be aware of these things. And I've noticed that the training, especially here in New Zealand, is changed a lot. I was trained in the UK, and I don't think culture was even mentioned as a word, and that was decades ago. But yeah, it's incredibly important. And we still got a long way to go, for sure. Yeah. And especially in recognizing the value of children's heritage languages.
Right.
So yeah.
I was going to ask then, with heritage languages, do you have any research on, immigrant families or whatever whose children don't really have that heritage language?
Yeah.
Or people who lost their heritage language?
Yeah. It's you can lose it in a generation. It takes 3 to get your heritage language back. So it's a really, it's a particularly important. It's such an important thing to consider because language and culture are so inextricably bound up. Our languages are, our vessels for our culture. And so, this is a whole topic of research, how you maintain a heritage language. And what is really important is actually input. You have to hear the language. And so the more you hear of it, the more likely you are to hold on to it. And so, there's plenty of research that shows that the quantity of language is really important. But in addition to that, the quality is also important. So if we come back to that idea of that little zone of proximal development, where you're just pushing the child a little bit further. And what you see, if as children grow up, your language that you use as a parent is going to become more sophisticated. And so that helps children develop their cognition because they've got these language tools. It means that they're going to engage in conversations that are a little bit more sophisticated. So they're going to build their language itself through that. And so you need both quantity and quality. So what that says is that, if a child is growing up in a heritage language context where there's the second language is actually the dominant language of the country, it's important that their heritage language is valued. And we had these, the product of the 60s is where, English was, considered the sort of the premium language. So the attitudes back then were that you need English in order to get ahead, and while that might be true to a certain extent, it means that we lose our heritage languages. And so we understand now that, children need to grow up in very rich language environments. And if that's your heritage language, that's what it should be. And children will learn the other dominant language because they're surrounded by it, And so I think there's been a big attitudinal change. And I've seen that with Te Reo Māori. It's very, very heartwarming, the change that I'm seeing in society and the attitudes towards it. I know there's a lot of pushback and we see that, but, in some, there's been a massive attitudinal change. And it can only be good for us. It's really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In that case, can I ask the benefits of knowing multiple languages?
Yes. Yeah, there are lots of benefits. So apart from having a strong identity, there's a lot of well-being benefits of being able to, interact with your cultural heritage. There are also benefits around just, cognitively, being flexible because you're able to switch between two languages. There's work that's been done to show that, if you're able to flexibly switch between languages, you develop these cognitive capacities that perhaps children who aren't able to do that, maybe not so flexible, may not be as flexible. So there's certainly, some cognitive advantages in addition to social advantages. It's really, the interesting thing is that most of the world is actually bilingual and multilingual. It's the Anglo-speaking world that tends to be more monolingual.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you come back to the research that's done that we almost treat monolingual children as if that's the norm, whereas in fact, if you look at the world as a whole, multilingual children are in fact the norm.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
learning something there.
Yeah.
I guess I had a final question that I thought of. Would you have advice for parents for sort of getting their children in that, what did you call it, the proximal...
That zone of proximal
development? But then also, what about, for educators, especially if you're an educator and you don't quite know maybe young people's context that they grew up in?
Yeah, that's right. And there's quite a lot to that question. But, I think it's noticing, noticing what your child is doing and responding to what your child is doing. And so that's a very sort of classic way, rather than sort of jumping in there. You notice what your child might be doing, and then maybe you might label what they're doing if they're a very, very young child. And they may not have the word for, cup or fire engine. They may not know that, but they might be playing with it. And then you can respond. You can just describe what they're doing. And then eventually, they might say fire engine, and you'll say something like, oh, you like the fire engine, or you're playing with the fire engine. And so what you're doing is that you're putting that word into a little sentence. And so it's taking your time to respond to, to what the child is doing. So that's just a very broad, general, way of interacting with very young children. What was the second part of your question?
Advice for educators.
Oh yeah, educators are very good at this, because they're taught these theories, and it's a very similar thing. There's a sort of an idea, for language development called serve and return, and so the child might serve something to you, and then you return back. So the serve could be they might say something to you, and you return back with some response to it, or they might be playing with something, and that's in a way like a serve. They're sort of lobbing the ball over to you and then you respond back. And it can go the other way, the educator might say something and you're waiting for the child to return with some kind of language. So, again, it's about sort of sensitivity and attending to what the child, might be doing or saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think educators generally are really skilled at this. Yeah, this kind of behaviour,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're just pushing them enough, but it's not something they've never mentioned or...
That's right, yeah. I mean, on the other hand, pushing your child a little bit is great. If you're talking about something that they completely have no idea about, that might be something very novel. And so the child might be really interested in that, So I think if you think about the richness of your language environment, that's what you're aiming for. You don't want to talk over them or be constantly talking. You want to be attending and talking in a way that sort of draws them in. But you want to be, using language that pushes them a little bit, might be talking about ideas they've never heard of or things they might not have seen, not just the here and now. And so that's another step that you can take. When you're talking with a young child, you might be focused on what's right in front of you. But if you talk about something that you did yesterday or something that you might do, that's not in front of you. All right. So that's another level that you're taking your language to. And that really helps children as well, talk about things that are not in the here and now. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, because we know you have other commitments and need to run, what we can do is we will end it here. And the last thing which we do is we ask people just a few general rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
So we'll ask a few of them real quick.
Okay.
Before we end.
Yeah.
And hopefully next time we get you on and you can speak for a lot longer and we can cover all the things which we barely touched.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so Olivia, do you want to start?
Summer or winter?
Oh my gosh, summer, definitely.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Movies or TV shows?
Oh, movies.
Yeah.
If your life were a movie, what genre would it be?
Definitely a romance.
Oh, yeah?
Actually, no. Can I change that?
Go.
Yeah.
Definitely like a kung fu thing.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
No one said kung fu before.
No.
Yeah.
Martial arts movie.
Martial arts for sure, yeah.
Yeah. What is a saying that other people say that you think is complete bullshit?
Oh my God. Lean and mean.
Lean and mean.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
If you were to have a superpower, what would it be?
Oh my God. Why did you prepare me for this? I have no idea. I've always wanted to just move objects. Wouldn't that be so cool?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I like it. I think everyone says a different one.
Yeah. You might enjoy this if you haven't heard. Your former student and a guest on our show, Dr. Tia Neha, said that her superpower would be finding a parking spot whenever.
Her superpower should be walking up the blooming hill.
Oh, yeah.
You can tell her that.
Yeah. Oh, dear. What is your least favourite genre of music?
Oh my god. This is really... Yeah, I'm not very good at this sort of thing, but kind of like death metal type stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Because you're a cultural researcher, what's your... If there was a place in the world which you can live, where would that be?
Yeah. Okay, I actually really love San Sebastian. Do you know San Sebastian?
Where's
in
that?
northern Spain?
Yeah.
We went there on sabbatical, and what I loved about it was that all the generations mixed. So there's lots of things I loved about it. The food was incredible, but it was a little bit like Wellington, Oriental parade, but all the generations mixed in the evenings. And so I just loved that, and I thought, well, I could retire here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That sounds beautiful. Yeah. I have to wrap my head around this question. Who, out of all the researchers, who is the most likely to win a drinking contest, and why is it a developmental researcher?
Out of all the researchers?
Yeah.
Like, you mean the different genres of research?
Yeah.
Oh my God. A drinking contest?
Yes.
Definitely the social psychs.
Yeah? What's that?
I'm sure they have quite rowdy get-togethers.
Yeah. I think so.
All right, final thing.
Yeah.
If you could give us one piece of advice to leave on, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. Know yourself. That would be my one piece of advice, yeah.
So the Western style of learning.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, no, I don't think it's just an individual thing. I think you can know yourself, and it doesn't matter, where you're being brought up. But I think knowing who you are, maybe that's a better way of describing it. Yeah, knowing who you are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Great. And if people wanted to contact you, how can they get in touch?
Oh, just via the VUW website. I'm on there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thanks everyone for listening. Give us a follow on Spotify, Apple Music. Oh, sorry, Apple Podcasts, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Apple Podcasts.
And
Instagram.
TikTok. Yeah, TikTok. Yeah. Should we be on Be Real soon as well?
Yeah. If people request it, we can do that. Yeah.
Yes, on all the socials.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, and until next time, know yourself. Or what's the other one you said? Know yourself better.
Yeah. Know who you are.
Know who you are. Thanks. Bye.
Awesome. Okay, bye-bye.